So let's begin our discussion in this module by talking about aggregate expenditure or desired aggregate expenditure, which again, we're just going to denote AE for short. So if you remember last module or last week, we talked about different ways to calculate real or actual, sorry, I should be careful with my language there, actual GDP, whether it's real or nominal. We talked about different ways of calculating GDP. We talked about the income method, the value-added method, and then we also discussed the expenditure method. And if you remember, we came up with this equation, or this definition, that actual national income, or GDP, or output, however we want to call it, they're all the same thing right now, was equal to CA plus IA plus GA plus NXA, where these A's indicated the actual amount. So this is the actual amount we see in our economy, let's say. Remember, CA was actual consumption expenditure, so cons for consumption, and we had actual investment expenditure, actual government purchases, and we had actual net exports. And so these were the actual amounts that we saw in our society. And so when we say Y, it means the actual amount of GDP. And so when we're thinking about desired aggregate expenditure, so this week maybe I'll say, just to give us a different kind of header here, we're thinking about aggregate expenditure equals, and it's going to look the same but without the A's. So now this is desired aggregate or desired expenditure. Aggregate expenditure. And so C without, CA, this A, the subscript A or lowercase a attached to the C meant the actual amount. Now when we leave out that A, it's like this theoretical amount, this desired level of it. And we'll kind of talk specifically about what we mean by desire. It's not, we wish we could all have this much money and blah, blah, blah. It's not, it's more realistic than that, but it's this theoretical amount. So this is desired consumption expenditure. Desired investment expenditure, and so on and so forth. So desired government purchases. Hopefully that's big enough for you to read. And finally, desired net exports. So think of this top equation with the A's on these expenditure categories as being the actual amount we see. And what we're kind of doing this week is thinking about theoretically how these different ones get determined. We're actually going to kind of concentrate it just on these first two, but how they get determined. So we're going to theoretically think about factors that are affecting how much consumption and investment expenditure we have in our economy. And we're going to kind of build a model which is going to be based on this AE function, using that intuition then when we think about, what's going to affect how much consumption expenditure we have. So this will be the theoretical amount that we're kind of building our model off of, and this is the actual amount we see in our society. And our equilibrium will be kind of connecting these two ideas. Okay, let's quickly erase this and talk about two different kinds of desired aggregate expenditure: autonomous and induced. All right, so let's make sure let's just rewrite that equation. So aggregate expenditure equals C plus I plus G plus NX. And again, this is the desired level, so this theoretical amount. When we think about different kinds of expenditure within our model, we can think about, two broad categories. And we kind of already have these categories here, but I'm thinking about a different way of kind of categorizing expenditure. we're going to have autonomous expenditure. So autonomous expenditure, and what this kind of expenditure is that it's not affected by how big national income is, or the size, I should say, of national income. It doesn't depend on Y. So expenditure that doesn't depend on the level of national income. And we're going to discuss it in a second, but let's think about consumption, just to maybe help with this explanation or this definition. Regardless of maybe your income, you always need to spend a certain amount of consumption just to live, right? And if that means borrowing money, whatever that means, you need a certain amount of income in order to kind of have some basic consumption in terms of food or shelter and things like that. And so that amount doesn't depend on national income. You're going to spend that no matter what. That would be kind of autonomous expenditure. This is going to be contrasted with induced expenditure. Again, EXP is for expenditure. And this is kind of expenditure that depends on the level. So this one doesn't depend on the level of national income. We can also think of some kind of expenditure that does depend on national income. And so we can also think of certain parts of maybe consumption expenditure where, if national income is higher, people spend more money, they spend a certain amount no matter what on basic goods, but as national income goes up, they may also start spending more money just because they have higher national income. And how this is kind of going to work within this model is, with these two categories, is that any expenditure that's not multiplied by Y is going to be autonomous. So think about one as, maybe this is a bad pen. Use this other one. One, so this is going to be like not multiplied by Y in our model. They're going to be kind of like constants. They're just going to, doesn't depend, it's going to be some factor of our model that doesn't depend on Y. And so induced expenditures in our model are going to be like multiplied, things that are multiplied by Y. Because if they're multiplied by Y, then they kind of depend on Y. If it's a positive number, then the higher Y is, the higher this expenditure would be. But this might be, a little bit confusing now, but hopefully as we kind of go through and introduce these, as we kind of get into what consumption and investment look like, it'll be a little bit more clear, and hopefully by the end of the module you kind of understand what I mean by autonomous and induced.